owning multiple practices can be success, but only if it's intentional. Otherwise, it's just very expensive self-sabotage.
There's this very misplaced belief that if you own multiple practices, your income should also grow in multiples. I am here to tell you that it's definitely not the case, especially if that's the only reason you're trying to expand.
What were the first fires that caught you off guard when you added that second practice?
People, always people. Staffing, personalities, culture. You can plan for numbers and square footage and equipment, but you cannot spreadsheet human behavior. More practices means more decision making, and decision fatigue is real.
Are there times in life where multi-practice ownership is just a bad idea?
Absolutely. If you're going through major personal transitions, new baby, caring for aging parents, health issues, or even just wanting more balance, this is probably not the season to scale. You need to know what you're building toward, because if you don't define the destination, you can end up building something that traps you. A business can be successful on paper and still feel like a cage.
So what does scaling well actually look like when you see it?
All right, welcome back to Project Confidence. I'm Dr. Amrita Patel.
And I'm Dr. Diana Nguyen.
Today we're tackling a topic that comes up constantly, especially once people get a taste of ownership and start thinking, should I do more of this?
This episode is called Owning Multiple Practices: Success or Self-Sabotage?
Because multi-practice ownership is glamorized a lot on social media, at conferences, even in casual conversations. But what we don't always talk about is the cost: financial, emotional, relational, and frankly, psychological.
Amrita, you are especially qualified to talk about this because you do own and operate multiple practices. You've scaled intentionally and have also seen what not to do. So let's break down the reality of what it means to have more than one location to your name. So before we get into the how, I want to ask why. Why do you think so many dentists aspire to owning multiple practices? What's the appeal?
I think there's this very misplaced belief that if you own multiple practices, your income should also grow in multiples. I am here to tell you that it's definitely not the case, especially if that's the only reason you're trying to expand.
It reminds me a little bit of Ryan Serhant, the real estate agent from Million Dollar Listing and Owning Manhattan, whose motto is expansion in all ways. Always.
I love that show.
Me too. And also, my mom was so sad when Ryan got married to Amelia. She was like, oh, she needs to be nicer to him. She's always so cold. And I was like, Mom, that's just reality TV editing. I'm sure she's a perfectly lovely person in real life. Okay, sorry. I veered way off topic there. Back to owning multiple dental practices.
It's okay. Also, you've probably seen or heard of other dentists scaling and growing to position themselves for the best private equity exit possible, which is great and all until you realize that you have to keep your offices producing and collecting the same way they were before the sale to actually get that full payout amount. And during those years, usually 3 to 5 until that threshold, you're paid as a W-2 employee, which means you lose all of the tax benefits of being an owner.
Do you think that most people go into it with a strategy or with a scarcity mindset? Like, I need to grab opportunities before someone else does?
I really think it's this, well, I see so-and-so doing it on social media, so it can't be that hard, and it's the easiest and only path to making more money, so I should do it too. That's the mentality that's going on.
Let's make this real. Can you walk us through your journey? When did you go from one practice to more than one?
6 months after I finished my GPR, which sounds totally crazy, but I think our listeners should know that I am the daughter of a dentist and also married to a dentist. So I had a support system and other people in place around me. We had patients coming to see us from further north of our area consistently, and we realized that there was more land and space available there. And so I started investigating opportunities literally during my last weeks of residency. Actually, I think I was sending them to you to be like, what do you think? Should we do this?
Oh yeah, that's right. I remember you were like, well, with this one, we'd also own the real estate. And then with this one, there's an in-house lab, but then we'd have to hire more staff and et cetera, et cetera. So was there a moment where you thought, oh wait, this is a lot more than I expected?
Every single day. It doesn't matter what systems you have in place or how you think it's going to go or how long you've been doing this. As a private practice owner scaling your small business, it is always a lot more than expected.
Every day is such an honest answer because I think people imagine that there's a point where it just suddenly feels manageable. Like once you've figured it out, the chaos will stop.
Yeah, that moment does not exist. The problems just change. You're not putting out the same fires, but there's always fires.
What were the first fires that caught you off guard when you added that second practice?
People, always people. Staffing, personalities, culture. You can plan for numbers and square footage and equipment, but you cannot spreadsheet human behavior. I remember thinking, okay, we've done this once, we know what we're doing, and then realizing very quickly that doubling practices doesn't double complexity, it multiplies it.
That's an important distinction because new owners think, I'll just replicate what worked.
Right, but replication only works if everything else stays constant, and it never does. Different staff, different patient expectations, different local dynamics.
So when you realized, wow, This is a lot. Was it more operational stress or emotional stress?
Both, but the emotional part surprised me more. That responsibility feels heavier. You're not just responsible for your own livelihood anymore, you're responsible for other people's mortgages, families, and stability.
That weight doesn't get talked about enough.
No, and when you add a second or third practice, the weight doesn't just add, it compounds. You're constantly asking yourself, did I make the right decision? Did I move too fast? Did I miss something?
And I think people assume that because someone looks confident from the outside, then they're not having those internal conversations.
Everyone is having those conversations. The difference, whether they admit it.
So when people hear that attaching multiple practices equals freedom, what does freedom actually look like in real life at that stage?
Freedom is very delayed, very delayed. Early on, it's actually less freedom, less flexibility, less mental space. You earn freedom later if you survive the growth phase without burning everything down. More practices means more decision making, and decision fatigue is real.
Did you ever find yourself missing that simplicity of just being a clinician?
All the time. There's days where I miss just treating patients and going home. No payroll, no leases, no legal emails at 10 p.m.
But obviously you kept going.
Because I also believe in the long-term vision. I just wish more people understood that the middle part, the messy, uncomfortable part, is unavoidable. If you go into multi-practice ownership expecting it to feel good right away, you're setting yourself up to feel like you're failing, even when you're not.
Let's get into the heart of this episode. In your experience, what's the difference between multi-practice ownership as success versus multi-practice ownership as self-sabotage? What are the signs that someone's scaling well versus scaling for all the wrong reasons?
I'd say the biggest tell is a poor support system.
Okay, so then let's unpack what that looks like.
So when someone tries to rapidly expand without having their team in place, if you're constantly trying to run around and put fires out, it's not going to get any better if you expand. I know we talk a lot about burnout and all its iterations, but this is the fastest way to burn out, truly. If you think managing one office is hard, it doesn't get easier.
So if you're already stressed with just one, the answer to alleviating that stress isn't having another one, like a baby.
Another big identifier is this. Are you running your practices or are your practices running you? We throw around the word system a lot, but if you don't have a common unified way to do things like billing or insurance verification or appointment confirmations, you'll always feel like you're fighting an uphill battle.
Do you think some people use expansion as a way to avoid fixing broken systems or dealing with team issues or even confronting whether they actually like clinical dentistry?
Yeah, for sure, because then it can always be someone else's responsibility and not yours. It's still your name on the door and you're still the one paying the bills, so it all still comes back to you.
That line, are you running your practices or are your practices running you? That's a gut check because a lot of people convince themselves that the chaos is temporary.
Right. They say it's just busy right now, or once we add this one more thing, it'll calm down. But chaos that comes from broken systems doesn't resolve itself. It multiplies.
And I think this is where people confuse growth with progress.
Exactly. Growth is adding and progress is stabilizing. If you keep adding without stabilizing, you're just stacking instability.
So when you say poor support system, you're not just talking about staff numbers, you're talking about the leadership structure too, right?
Right. Who's making decisions when you're not there? Who handles conflict? Who owns the systems day to day? If the answer is me always, that's a huge warning sign.
Because then expansion just creates more spaces where you are needed.
Exactly. And then that's when people start feeling trapped by something that they thought would create freedom.
I also want to come back to something you said earlier about burnout, because people often think that burnout is just working too many hours, but usually it's actually about lack of control and that feeling that no matter how hard you work, things aren't improving.
And expansion without systems makes that feeling constant. You're always reacting and never leading.
Do you see differences in how people talk about expansion when it's healthy versus when it's self-sabotage?
Definitely. People scaling really well talk about capacity. They ask, do we have the bandwidth? People scaling poorly talk about escape. I just need something to change. If the motivation is, I hate being here, adding another location won't fix that. Usually makes it worse because now you've doubled the thing you're trying to run away from.
I also think that there's a little bit of an ego component that doesn't get talked about enough, like the idea that more practices equals more legitimacy or more success.
Yeah, and that can push people to expand before they're ready just to keep up appearances, but the bank account, the team, and your mental health doesn't care about optics.
So what does scaling well actually look like when you see it?
It looks boring, and that's a compliment. The same systems everywhere, predictable days, leaders in place, and an owner who isn't constantly putting out fires.
I like that, boring as a success metric.
Boring means sustainable. Boring means you're not panicking.
So if someone listening feels constantly overwhelmed, stretched thin, and resentful of their practice, but also feels pressured to grow, what would you want them to pause and ask themselves?
I'd want them to ask, what am I hoping this next practice will fix? And then be brutally honest about whether that's actually realistic. Because if the answer is, I just want things to feel easier, expansion's probably self-sabotage.
Let's talk about the costs people don't put on Instagram. What are the hidden costs of owning multiple practices that new owners won't anticipate?
Literally everything, depending on how large you get, your staff costs increase dramatically. So does IT, supplies, lab bills, you name it, it all goes up. This is why I said that income growth isn't exponential. Even for high ticket procedures like the all on X's, once you get done paying all your fees and bills associated with the procedure and your specialist to do it, as an owner on a $35,000 case, you probably end up with around $5,000 of profit.
Wait, that's it? After everything that goes into one of those cases?
Yep, that's it.
Damn. Okay, so then what surprised you the most once you crossed into that multi-practice territory?
The work truly never ends. There's always something going on, and it's not like you can leave it at the door and walk into your house and forget about it.
That whole, not being able to go home and not think about the practice thing is exactly why I ultimately never pursued practice ownership. I went to dental school thinking, just like the majority of dental students think when they enter dental school today, that I was just going to get out and then work towards owning my own solo practice one day. But then when I saw that the practice owners I worked for still had to troubleshoot issues home or over the phone when they were technically out of the office and even on vacation, I said, nope, I am not about that life. For me, it's really important for me to be able to turn off the dentistry when I want to, and it's sounding like that's next to impossible for someone who has multiple practices. All right, something I see a lot, especially as an educator, is that dentists underestimate how much leadership changes when you own more than one practice. How did your role shift when you went from one practice to two?
I started being more hands-on with the hiring processes because I wanted to see how personalities would mesh together, especially when I wasn't physically present. And that's probably been the most eye-opening part of the process. No matter how much you love clinical dentistry, you're going to have to carve out time to do these kinds of things. That's going to reduce your chairside time.
Did you ever struggle with that identity shift, going from best clinician in the room to the person who doesn't always know what's happening day to day?
I feel like it's constant whiplash sometimes, and I know that there are people listening thinking, why the hell is she doing this anyway then? But it's truly the most gratifying thing to be able to provide comprehensive care under one roof to patients all throughout the area that I grew up in. The thing I've learned is that you have to let go and trust the people around you a bit, because if you don't, something will give. And that something is usually your sanity or mental stability.
I want to say this explicitly because people need to hear it. Who should not own multiple practices? Like, what kinds of personality traits or life stages or circumstances would make this a bad idea?
Type A personalities, which most of us are, unfortunately, probably not the best fit for this. That's why many of us who do decide to scale end up being miserable and burnt out. Not having everyone on board is another bad sign. Talk to your existing team and the people you are around you before you start spending 6- and 7-figure amounts to do this. You want to know that you've got people on your side.
And then on the flip side, what's maybe a healthier alternative for someone who wants growth but not the chaos?
Associate at a few different offices, learn different ways of practice, take care of different groups of patients, same sort of feel, way less personal chaos.
I really appreciate you calling out the type A piece because that's uncomfortable for a lot of us to hear, but it's probably very true.
It is, and I say that as a type A person myself. When you're wired to want control, precision, predictability, multi-practice ownership can feel like death by 1,000 paper cuts because you can't control everything anymore. You have to be okay with good enough in a lot of areas or you'll drive yourself and everyone else crazy.
And that's such a mindset shift for dentists because we're trained to be detail-oriented and exact.
Yeah, dental school requires and rewards perfection, right? Multi-practice ownership requires tolerance for imperfection. The mismatch alone can make people miserable.
I also want to go back to what you said about not having everyone on board because I think people underestimate how big a deal that is.
It's very important. If your core team isn't aligned, expansion creates resentment instead of excitement. Suddenly people feel stretched, overlooked, or threatened, and that resentment shows up in ways people don't expect.
Like how?
Turnover increases, communication breaks down, the culture that you worked so hard to build starts to fracture. So before anyone signs on the dotted line, they should be having some very honest conversations. Ask your team how they feel about growth. Ask who wants more responsibility, who doesn't, and whether anyone is already at capacity, because expansion without buy-in isn't just risky, it's lonely.
Let's talk about life stage for a second. Are there times in life where multi-practice ownership is just a bad idea?
Absolutely. If you're going through major personal transitions, new baby, caring for aging parents, health issues, or even just wanting more balance, this is probably not the season to scale. And that doesn't mean never. It just means not right now.
I also love what you said about healthier alternatives because I think people feel like it's either scale or stagnate.
And that's just not true. Associating at different offices gives you exposure without ownership level stress. You learn what you like, what you hate, and what kind of environment you thrive in.
And you're still growing, just in a different way.
Yes, you're growing skills, judgment, perspective, and you're doing it without risking your sanity or your financial future.
Let's talk money, because that's so often the unspoken driver. Is owning multiple practices always more profitable, or is it sometimes just more, period?
I think a little of both, but as an owner, you're going to want to invest back into your business so you aren't always taking an exponentially larger paycheck. The pot is just bigger, but so is the outflow, if that makes sense.
What's one financial assumption you wish new owners would stop making?
So many. You don't need to sign year-long contracts with companies. Do your due diligence before hiring a marketing company because most of them overpromise and underdeliver. Same with labs, patient communication software, EMR. I could go on and on.
I think people hear revenue and immediately think income.
Exactly. Revenue sounds impressive, but profit is actually what changes your life. And with multiple practices, your revenue might double, but your expenses don't just double, they often expand in new categories.
Like layers of management, additional benefits, more vendors.
Yep, more payroll, more insurance, more maintenance, more legal and accounting costs. Every new location adds complexity, and complexity is expensive.
So when people say, once I have multiple practices, I'll finally be financially free, what are they missing?
They're missing the reinvestment phase. If you want sustainability, you can't just pull more money out. You have to reinvest in systems, people, and infrastructure, or everything falls apart.
Which means that your personal paycheck doesn't necessarily scale at the same pace as your business.
Exactly. Early on, a lot of the extra money is spoken for before you ever see it.
That's a really important expectation to set, especially for new owners who think scaling equals instant lifestyle upgrade.
And when that doesn't happen, people feel disappointed or trapped, even though the business itself might be doing well.
Let's go back to what you said about assumptions, because that list you started is long.
It is. New owners often assume that bigger means more professional, so they sign long-term contracts without really understanding what they're committing to.
Because it feels like what successful businesses do.
Exactly, but flexibility is everything early on. You don't want to be locked into a year-long or multi-year agreement with a vendor that isn't delivering. Also, marketing is a huge one. Marketing companies are very good at selling the dream, but very few are actually accountable to outcomes. If you don't know how to measure ROI, you're super vulnerable.
And it's not just the marketing. There's labs and software and communication platforms.
All of it. Each one promises to save you time or increase production, but if you layer too many tools without strategy, you end up paying more to feel more overwhelmed.
So the assumption that more tools equals more efficiency is then often wrong.
Very wrong. Sometimes fewer tools, well used, are far more effective.
If you could give one money-related piece of advice to someone considering their second or third practice, what would it be?
Slow down financially. Just because you can afford something doesn't mean you should buy it yet. Cash flow is oxygen. You don't feel the lack of it until it's gone, and by then, it's usually too late.
Okay, let's get practical. If someone listening is seriously considering multi-practice ownership, what questions should they ask themselves before signing anything?
Where do you see yourself in 10, 15, or 20 years? What's your exit strategy? What are you trying to accomplish? And do you have the support to do it?
And now, if you could go back and talk to yourself before your second or third practice, what would you say?
Hire more staff, continuously hire, actually. You always need more help than you think. And now you've got some great virtual assistant options around, so you can have that going too.
I love that your first questions are those long-term ones, because so many people make these decisions based on what feels urgent, not what actually aligns with their life.
Exactly. Expansion shouldn't be a reaction. It should be a choice that fits into a bigger picture. And the exit strategy question, people hear that and think, I'm not going anywhere. But everyone exits eventually, whether it's selling, bringing on partners, or stepping back clinically. You need to know what you're building toward, because if you don't define the destination, you can end up building something that traps you. A business can be successful on paper and still feel like a cage.
You mentioned support. So what does that actually mean in real terms?
Support at multiple levels: professional support, managers, consultants, accountants, emotional support, people who understand what you're carrying, and logistical support, help at home, help with kids, help with life, because you can't scale a business if everything else in your life is already maxed out.
Okay, now let's talk about your advice to your past self, because hire more staff sounds simple, but that sounds like it's loaded advice.
It totally is. I waited too long to get help because I thought I should be able to handle this. That mindset is incredibly common and incredibly damaging, especially for dentists. We're trained to be self-sufficient, but multi-practice ownership, not a solo sport.
And I love that you mentioned virtual assistants, because that's such a modern option that people don't always consider.
Virtual help can be game-changing for scheduling, verification, phone calls, even administrative tasks. You don't need to hire everyone in-house to get support.
So the question isn't, can I afford help? It's, can I afford not to have help?
Right, because burnout, far more expensive than payroll.
If someone is on the fence right now, maybe excited but scared, what would you tell them to do before they move forward?
Pause. Talk to people who've done it, not just the ones who are thriving, but the ones who've struggled. Learn from both, because the glossy success stories are only part of the picture, and usually the least instructive part.
Okay, this feels like a good moment to zoom out and bring everything together, because we've talked about success, sabotage, money, people, and systems. I love this conversation because it challenges the idea that more automatically means better. If you had to redefine success for dentists listening today, especially our new grads and early owners, how would you define it?
Internal peace. That is being satisfied and happy with where you're at and where you're going. This has nothing to do with what anyone else is doing, including you and I, and everything to do with your own path and what you see for yourself in the future.
My takeaway from all of this is that owning multiple practices can be success, but only if it's intentional. Otherwise, it's just very expensive self-sabotage.
Big time. Just ask all the dancing dentists on TikTok and Instagram.
If this episode made you pause, even just a little, that's the point. Success doesn't have to look the same for everyone.
And if you found this helpful, share it with someone who's thinking about scaling and needs a reality check.
And as always, thanks for being a part of Project Confidence.
Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us at Project Confidence on Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, or email us at projectconfidence@gmail.com.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye.